Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm your host Rakshith Shetty, a research analyst at Takshashila Institution, and I have with me my colleague Anisree Suresh, who's also a researcher at Takshashila. And today we are exploring carbon pricing in India, a topic that's gained significant attention due to the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. This mechanism is putting pressure on Indian businesses, and India is now considering various policy options, including carbon pricing and taxes, to address this challenge. And Anisree will be talking more about this. So, Anisree, what exactly is carbon pricing?
Thank you, Rakshith. So, carbon pricing is an economic instrument that it's being widely, employed across the world that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by attaching a cost to carbon. So, the goal of carbon pricing is to internalize the environmental cost associated with the carbon emissions, encouraging all the emitters to reduce their carbon footprint. So, it's widely recognized as a key tool for mitigating climate change, and it has been adopted in various forms in numerous countries and regions around the world. So if you look at the European Union's carbon border mechanism itself, that's one of the emission trading system.
Mhm.
So the emission trading system is basically you have a regulatory authority that sets a limit or cap on the total amount of greenhouse gases emissions allowed within a specific jurisdiction or sector. So then the emitters are then issued or allocated emission allowances, so each permitting the holder to emit only a certain amount of greenhouse gases. So then you can trade these allowances with one another in the market, with emitters needing fewer allowances will be able to sell their allowances to other emitters. So that's how basically the emission trading system works. It's a very great market mechanism that allows carbon to be traded and all those things. So it's a one of the mechanism. Another aspect is you also have carbon taxes, where you have a carbon tax directly sets a price on carbon emissions, usually based on the carbon content of fossil fuels and all those things. So this tax is applied at the point of production or when you're importing certain product, and passing the cost along the supply chain and ultimately influencing the consumer prices of certain products and everything. So whatever revenue that you generate from a carbon tax, then they can be used to offset other taxes. Basically you can recycle this revenue in terms of investing in clean energy technologies or support vulnerable communities impacted by the climate change and all those things. So that's the basic one. And you also have this other implicit mechanisms of carbon pricing. You have fuel taxes that give it the fuel excise taxes, and then you have renewable energy subsidies. These all are various mechanisms of carbon pricing.
Mhm. That's a great explanation, Anisree. But do you really consider carbon pricing as a valid economic tool that could reduce the emissions and tackle climate change? I mean, what does exactly it do in a market?
Yeah. So basically, when you're looking at the market, and we have the concept of market failure and all those things, right? So climate change is considered as a consequences of a market failure in many of the theories. So because when you're producing or when you're doing goods and services trade and all of those things, are we really accounting the environmental cost of greenhouse gases and emissions? That's the basics of this theory. So this kind of because we're not able to calculate the environmental cost of every production, this kind of allows businesses, individuals, and all those people to essentially treat the atmosphere or the environment as a free resource, which is not the truth sometimes. So which leads to what? Excessive emissions. So carbon pricing basically will help us to correct the market failure by internalizing this external cost of emissions. But having said that, that's easy said in theory, but there are a lot of challenges and all those things. I think in the coming minutes we'll talk about those points as well. So basically the aim of putting a price on carbon is you aim to promote cost effective emission reductions by you incentivize businesses and individuals to find the most efficient way to reduce their emissions, and then you also drive the clean technology innovation and generate revenue for climate action and other priorities and all those things through carbon taxing and all those things. So while carbon pricing is a powerful tool for addressing climate change, its implementation again presents a lot of opportunities as well as challenges. So here key factor that we have to consider is what's the design of the carbon pricing mechanism, how it impact the competitiveness of the product or the trade that we looking at, and what are the distributional effects, particularly looking at the development economies and all those things. So what is the distributional effect on these economies?
Right. I remember yesterday when we were when we were basically discussing to have this topic as our next podcast, you mentioned how EU's carbon border mechanism poses certain challenges for Indian exports to the EU market, right?
Yeah.
And for our listeners' benefit, can you explain that more? How would carbon pricing or carbon taxes help India overcome these trade challenges?
So when we're having this I think since last year we're having a lot of conversations about how European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism is going to have an impact on Indian businesses, especially those businesses exporting carbon intensive goods to the EU market.
Mhm.
So and there are a lot of worries, concerns among the exporters based on the fact that this will likely to reduce the competitiveness of Indian products in the EU market due to the added cost associated with carbon emission. So if you look at the further, there's what are the various aspects that have an impact on the competitiveness and all those things. One is it's has a higher cost for exporters. So what basically CBM does is it imposes a carbon tariff on imports from countries without a comparable carbon pricing mechanism. So India does not have an explicit carbon tax. What we have is implicit carbon taxes, what we give through fossil fuel subsidies and fuel excises, but it's not explicit in nature. So you can't exactly calculate how it has an impact on the carbon emission, whether it's able to reduce and all those things. So that's not considered as a significant comparable carbon pricing mechanism by EU standards.
Right.
So what happens is when Indian exporters of the goods that's covered under the carbon border adjustment mechanism, such as you take the example of steel and aluminium, they will face additional cost, potentially making their products more expensive in the EU market. So beginning in the 2026 and all those things, EU will collect a carbon tax on steel and aluminium, estimated to be equivalent to 20 to 35% of the existing tariff. So that will definitely have an impact on the profitability of the Indian firms. And it's also very concerning for industry like aluminium, steel and all those things. And that's one of the major exports of India to Europe. So all those things will definitely have an impact, and then it will reduce the demand and competitiveness of Indian products in the EU market. So this shift could result in a decline in the market share for Indian businesses and potentially impacting overall export revenues. And it also putting a pressure on pricing and marketing strategies for India. So because of all these challenges, the CBM's implementation could force Indian exporters to adjust their pricing strategies to absorb some of the additional carbon cost. So that will increase the prices of all the products that's going from India to European market. So that again affect the competitiveness. So basically this also diverts certain trade away from India to other countries. If you take the example of China has been able to adopt certain carbon pricing strategies to their economy and everything. So they might be able to get a lot of trade that's diverting from Indian market and all those countries. And definitely compliance costs, all this pressure to decarbonize and everything without considering India's economic demands. That's also going to be another issues. But I think India has been able to engage and negotiate with EU a lot, but there's no much progress. That kind of emphasize the point that India might have to develop domestic carbon pricing mechanism.
Cool. You put a really good case. I completely agree that although carbon pricing might help India retain its global markets in the future, there are also various challenges, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to designing such an economic tool as carbon pricing. I mean, I'm not able to imagine, I mean, what kind of potential design of this particular carbon pricing would look like in India.
Yeah. So I think one of the major challenges also designing of certain policy tools like that. So one is like we already have, like I said earlier, that we have an implicit pricing mechanism.
Mhm.
So currently India relies on a system of implicit carbon mechanisms you have fuel excise taxes, which covers almost like 54.7% of the carbon emissions. However, this approach kind of lacks transparency and direct connection to carbon emissions. So there is a need for a more explicit and comprehensive carbon pricing framework as such. So there's a lot of conversation going on, whether India should introduce a carbon tax as such. So where we have to consider elements like tax base, tax rate, and all those things. So carbon tax in India could target fossil fuels based on their carbon content. So aligning with international best practices and simplifying the tax administration by focusing on inputs rather than direct emissions related to that. So there is that's a potential design of carbon pricing in India is a very good question that we have to answer. So currently India relies on a system of implicit carbon pricing primarily through fuel excise taxes, which cover 54.7% of the emissions. However, because of there are issues with this policy, because it's implicit in nature, it lacks certain transparency and direct connection to carbon emissions. So there's a need for more explicit and comprehensive carbon pricing framework. So there are a lot of conversation going around introducing a carbon tax as such. So potential for a carbon tax in India, we have to include key design elements such as tax base, where you look at the carbon tax in India could target the fossil fuel based on their content and all those things. And this approach aligns with the international best practices and simplifying the tax administration by focusing on inputs rather than the direct emissions measurement. And then you also look at the tax rate, where you try to include the social cost of carbon, linking the tax rate to the estimated economic damage caused by the carbon emissions. So there are a lot of calculations and approaches by various studies available that we can calculate the social cost of carbon to include in the tax approach. And then you also look at the abatement cost. So I'm not getting into the technicalities of these things. And definitely one thing we have to look at it when we're talking about the design of carbon taxes is that we have to look at it from a phased implementation. Because you're looking at the political economy of India and all those things, you have to have a phased and incremental approach to introducing a carbon tax in India. So this strategy involves starting with a relatively low tax rate and gradually increasing it over time, and also allowing businesses and other operations to adapt and adjust to this method and all those things. And one most important thing is how are you going to recycle the revenue you're getting out of this taxes, right? So the potential revenue generated from a carbon tax in India is significant. We have to see how we can reinvest this in renewable energy and clean technology, how we can have certain R&D going into in partnership with the private partners to looking at how we can develop certain green technologies, and how we're going to fund climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies and all those things. So yeah, we'll get into the other things later. Maybe, that's all in terms of design.
Tax. I mean, it has always been a very sensitive and a very complex issue in India's public policy, right? What are the challenges that you see of introducing such taxations and carbon pricing in India?
Yeah. So you're right, Rakshith. That's addressing challenges and concerns is the major aspect that we have to look at it when we're talking about such taxation. So there is this theory called the marginal cost of public fund. So every time you think of adding a tax or anything, you have to see how that tax has an impact on our economy, GDP, and the society. So every time you see how the public fund is being utilized and everything, you have to see whether that's cost to the economy and societies is also being calculated. So in the same way, if you look at the carbon pricing in India, you have to look at it from various sections. Like one is like, what is the distributional impact and the equity concerns related to all those things.
Right.
So implementing a carbon tax without disproportionately burdening vulnerable populations is one of the crucial factors that we have to consider. So given the structure of the Indian economy with a significant informal sector, and we have widespread poverty, carbon pricing could have regressive effects if not implemented carefully. So there's a need for effective revenue recycling mechanisms to offset these negative impacts on low income households, such as using carbon tax revenues for targeted social programs, or like, how we're going to reinvest it in clean energy access for certain communities, and whether like, you moving away from carbon intensive sectors to like, less carbon intensive sectors. So what are the employment laws, how the economy is going to be affected by it, and how we can like engage the people through reskilling and economic diversification also. Second factor is like definitely we have to look at the political feasibility and public acceptance of such policies. Like, we have to see that policies that aim to shift to a low carbon economy will inevitably create certain winners and losers in the market. That's how the market functions also in a way. So like, there will be certain pushback from carbon industry. And Rakshith, you might know that like India also has a lot of fossil fuel subsidies, like, where you subsidize the fossil fuel industries in India. So like, that will definitely have a certain pushback as well. Then you definitely have administrative and implementation cost, establishing and maintaining carbon pricing system, particularly like, if you're like talking about the emission trading system, that involves significant administrative cost. So like, you have like cost including setting up the necessary infrastructure for monitoring, reporting, and verifying emissions, and establishing a robust registry for it, and ensuring market oversight and compliance and all those things. So this complexity is like amplified in India due to the large number of entities involved. We are not like a small country that we can manage it all like single-handedly.
Right.
So there is like, there's a lack of mandatory greenhouse gas reporting system in India, and we have very limited experience with such mechanisms. And then you look at it overall, we have the data availability and capacity constraints as well. Like, India lacks a comprehensive and mandatory greenhouse gas reporting system, posing a challenge for both carbon tax administration and the emission trading system implementation and all those things. So building institutional capacity for effective monitoring, reporting, and all those things, and data management is crucial for successful carbon pricing. Then India is also like, we know that in Bangalore also and in many cities, electricity is highly subsidized in India. So when there is a lot of subsidy going into electricity, fossil fuel, and all those things, we will not be able to calculate the prices of carbon emissions effectively. So like, you have to see like how this new policy will integrate with the existing policies, how like, we have a lot of regulations on energy, environment, and industry in India. So how it's going to like clash and work well with the existing policies is also something that we have to consider. And again, you have to, at the end of the day, developing economies like India's main concern is like how you balance your economic growth with emission reduction. So like, we have to prioritize the economic growth, poverty reduction alongside its climate commitments. And how do we find a balance between these objectives is the most crucial thing that we have to look at, because carbon pricing could definitely hinder certain economic activities, particularly in energy intensive sectors, which are also vital for growth and employment. So like, we are like heavily reliant on fossil fuels, especially coal for its energy needs, make this a balancing act even more challenging. Yeah.
Right. There was Anisree, to be honest, there was low-key depressing. I mean, the number of challenges that you have just shared with me.
Yeah. There are more.
Okay.
Like definitely it's got to impact our trade in overall matter. So that's the most important aspect that I want to highlight here.
But I think for today's podcast, that's more than enough challenges that we have. But really, I want to know how can we overcome, I mean, how can the public, I mean, policymakers also draft such policies which can overcome to ensure trade competitiveness, as you mentioned, for Indian products in the international markets?
So I think like one factor that I feel like that I have to highlight here is like, see, carbon pricing is like an effective mechanism and all these things. But at this point, India is kind of forced to look at certain kind of like, that kind of a market government tool, government intervention as such. Because like, it's mostly the geopolitics and how developed economics like EU kind of through these policies, through this unilateral trade measures, forcing domestic economies like India to like, look at carbon pricing and all those things, because it definitely has an impact on our trade and export and everything. It will have a lot of cost as well. But because of this geopolitical pressure, India is forced to like look at like, the possibility of developing a robust domestic carbon pricing system. So like India had tried to negotiate with the EU, and we also trying to take this case to WTO as well to see like, whether we can come up with some negotiation, some adjustment with EU in terms of giving some exemption for Indian manufacturers. Okay, but that might not work as well for us. So we have to look at like, how we can develop a robust domestic carbon pricing system. So establishing a domestic carbon pricing mechanism such as a carbon tax or an emission trading system is crucial for India to like, address these challenges posed by the carbon border adjustment mechanism and also like promote its climate goals. So actually they say that like, a well designed carbon pricing system will be able to incentivize emission reductions and will be able to generate certain revenue and also like demonstrate where India stands in terms of its economic growth while balancing its climate aspirations and all those things. And so along with that, what we have to look at is like, how we can promote the renewable energy and energy efficiency, which is also like happening. But one thing is like, we also have to look at our own energy reforms as well, like, the electricity subsidy, like, who are the actual beneficiaries and how can we move from this fossil fuel subsidies and electricity subsidy to more like, sustainable energy options and all those things. And there will be certain industries that will be definitely affected with all these policies. So we have to also look at it like how can we move the smooth transition to clean energy options and all those things. And again, we have to continue our negotiations with the EU and other trading partners. So India should continue to engage in dialogue with the EU and other trading partners to address these concerns. And we probably like, as a if WTO is strengthened enough, it should also look at like how certain unilateral measures such as carbon border adjustment mechanism has a negative impact on the economies and all those things. And also like, yeah, we have to look at like how we can invest more in research and development of low carbon technologies, providing subsidies and incentives for renewable energy development, supporting the development of green infrastructure and all those things. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
As we wrap up our discussion on carbon pricing in India, I mean, it's clear that we are at a crucial juncture, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the opportunities are huge, but so are the challenges. But by carefully designing and implementing a carbon pricing, as you said, system that is sensitive to India's unique economic landscape and the needs to its people, India has the potential to drive innovation and create new green energy industries and position itself as a global leader in sustainable development. And Anisree, thank you so much for providing such a comprehensive overview of this complex topic. And to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And see you all in the next episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.